This is Eleanor Perfetto from the National Health Council, and I want to welcome you today to our webinar. And I have to myself back in because I got kicked out here, so if you'll just bear with me for a moment. We're very happy to be able to provide this webinar to you. Sentinel program has been going on for a number of years, and I'm sure many of you have heard a great deal about it over time. Today we get to hear an update about what's happening, what it is, what they're doing, how patients are being engaged in the work. And so we're very happy to be able to provide this overview and just being able to get logged in. So I want to introduce our two speakers. We're going to have Daniela Stanjovic. I know I'm pronouncing this incorrectly. Stojanovic, who is an epidemiologist, and she's in the Sentinel core team, and she's in the Office of Surveillance and Epidemiology at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. Followed by Stephen Nikita. Stephen is the lead for the Sentinel Engagement Partners Workgroup and a Sentinel Planning Board member, and he's with the Spinal Muscular Atrophy Foundation, and he's also a patient advocate. And so it's going to be tagged today because we get to hear both of them present from more of the update technical perspective and one from the activities of what's been going on with the Engagement Partners Workgroup. Okay, go to the next slide, now that I'm caught up with you. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniela Stojanovic. Daniela, you want to take over?
Sure, thank you so much for that introduction and for hosting this webinar. We're very excited about this opportunity, so I'll go ahead and get started, and we'll leave enough time for everyone's questions. Next slide, please. Okay, so just a quick outline. I will give a brief background on Sentinel, including history of the Sentinel initiative, then provide some information about our data and how we use Sentinel in the regulatory process, and then finally we can together discuss some ways for you to get involved. Next slide, please. The Sentinel is our active safety surveillance system for assessing use, safety, effectiveness of regulated medical products. We also use it for development of different methodologic capabilities. Some of the main features of Sentinel are it is a distributed data network of partners. It uses electronic healthcare data, common data model, which I will talk a little bit more later, and it has extensive quality assurance process. Sentinel was created in response to a U.S. congressional mandate. Next slide, please. So the Sentinel initiative began in 2000 as a multi-year effort to create a national monitoring system of FDA regulated medical products. It started as a pilot in 2009. It was known as Mini Sentinel, and it was fully launched in 2016 as Sentinel system. Next slide, please. So Sentinel is currently comprised of administrative and claims data from health insurers. We refer to this as secondary data. You also may have heard real world data, but pretty much these data are collected for different purposes, for payment or billing, to document clinical care, physician decision support when treating patients, record keeping, as well as registries. The important part is that these data provide rich information for assessing safety issues that may arise in treating patients. Next slide, please. So this slide just kind of talks a little bit more about different types of data that I mentioned on the previous slide, but as everyone is aware, every time there is a healthcare encounter, there's a claim that is generated. So data are administrative data, then clinical data collected for clinical care and supporting physician decision-making, and then registries that target specific conditions of interest. Next slide, please. This is a current snapshot of our statistics. We have over 300 million cumulative patient identifiers for about 18 years. And we refer to this as patient identifiers, not unique patients, because you may be in one healthcare plan, and then when you transition in a different healthcare plan, you will be in the Sentinel distributed database twice, but at different times. So this is the reason we don't call them unique patients. And we also have over 70 million members that are currently accruing new data. The rest of the numbers are just for your information, but the most important to already mentioned. Next slide. So this slide shows the Sentinel distributed database growth over time. There was an initial goal of 25 million that was surpassed for the July 2010 deadline. And as you can see over time, there's generally an increase in the member enrollment. And by member, we mean members of the healthcare plan. And most recently, we added CMS fee-for-service data, which happened last year in January. Next slide, please. So this slide illustrates Sentinel distributed database. So the distributed data approach in which data partners maintain control over data in their existing environments. As you can see here, so the approach uses a standardized data structure. We also refer to it as Sentinel data model. Data partners transform their data look, which enables them to execute standardized computer programs at each site, and then they review the results and they send them to a secure portal to our Sentinel Operations Center. So the data are stored securely. Next slide, please. So the main benefit of the distributed approach is that it minimizes the need to share patient identifiable information. It means it preserves patient privacy as well as institutional proprietary interests. And as you can see here, so only minimally necessary information is shared in any analysis. And I think the rest on the previous slide. So next slide, please. So this is a list of our collaborators. As you can see, it's more for your information, but it's a nice mix of different types of institutions. The number of collaborators generally increases over time. And then there's a link at the bottom. You can see a full list of data partners and scientific partners and everyone else with the lead of the token. Next slide. Okay, so why do we think Sentinel is so important? As we mentioned earlier, it generates real-world evidence to support regulatory actions and to inform healthcare providers. There are various questions Sentinel was used to answer and can be used to answer. I have some examples in the next couple of slides, but here we just listed, if we're just curious, like plain drug use, tablets of certain drug were dispensed in certain. That's like very simple, straightforward question that we can look at. And we can also look at complex questions of a certain safety outcome among patients who were, let's say, on drug X and Y, compared to who were on different, like drug X and Z. And then there's a lot of other questions that, next slide. I don't know if everyone can see, but so these are just some of the examples I wanted to show. So for our transparency purposes, we post everything on the website. The first example was looking at opioid products, and we looked at utilization patterns as well as patient characteristics. So these results were presented at the advisory committee meeting, and there's a link on our website to the results as well as all the other materials. We also look at user characteristics, like here for leucemia, and it was mainly related to assessing cardiovascular risk. Next, please. There's some just a few other snapshots of the examples. Another example is we can look at duration of follow-up, how long were patients followed up, and then duration of use, like in the first example of non-insulin antidiabetics. And then we also looked at off-label use of SGLT2 inhibitors. As most of us are aware, they're indicated in type 2 diabetes. There was a question of its use in type 1 and diabetic ketoacidosis. So these results were also presented at an advisory committee. Another area that we can use Sentinel is exposure to certain drugs in pregnancy. In this case, it was dolutegravir containing products. There was a study that suggested a higher risk of neural tube defects among offspring. So we looked at exposure in among women, I believe it was the first trimester. But now we have mother-infant link, so we can pretty much look at exposure before, during, and after pregnancy, and we can see for the mothers who are linked to their infants, we can look at if there are any congenital malformations in those infants. So these are just some examples, and the full list is available online. Next slide, please. Okay, so how can patients or patient groups get involved? This is where I'd like to hear from you that you may have, but some ways that we listed here are just generally raising awareness through advisory boards, newsletters, blogs, and also like outreach to some of the during professional meetings, and I guess as well as these boards. We also would like to visit our website where we post updates, any kind of news related to safety issues, and then also you can attend our public workshops and meetings. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot from this year's annual public workshop. We hosted a 3-day meeting. First day was workshop, second day was hands-on training provided by our Sentinel Operations Center. And it was mainly for those people who are interested in learning more about analytic tools and getting some of the studies. Since everything is posted online, it was a hands-on workshop. And then day 3, we hosted international regulators where we discussed some ways that FDA assesses safety issues pre-market as well as post-market. So next year is supposed to be last of March, our annual public workshop. So we invite you to register. And I have a link later where they would be posting a registration link. Next slide, please. I also wanted to share Sentinel's 5-year strategy. So you this document from the link, but in the next 5 years, I focus on innovations emerging from new data science disciplines. There are also different strategic aims, and you can read more about them in this document. Next slide, please. So to summarize my part, Sentinel is our active surveillance system with over 300 million patient identifiers and generates real-world evidence. There are multiple ways to stay informed. Some are listed here, and we welcome your additional ideas. And I have my email, contact information if you have any follow-up questions, as well as our team's email there on the next slide.
Hello, everyone. This is Steve Makita. A huge thank you to the National Health Council and particularly Eleanor and Silka for sponsoring and facilitating this webinar. Next slide, please. FDA established our work group to help publicize to 4 important constituencies what Sentinel is all about, As the patient representative to the Sentinel Planning Board for the last 4 years, I was honored to be selected as the work group lead. Next slide, please. Each member of our work group provided invaluable feedback and expertise in crafting each of the tailored narratives. They were selected because of their knowledge and understanding of their audiences. Special thanks go to Rich Platt for his overall vision and ongoing insights into our entire project. I could not have done any of this work without the contributions of Susan Farrow, the program manager at the Sentinel Operations Center. Next slide, please. The narratives generally describe the same aspects of Sentinel, very different reading levels to reflect diverse points of view. Our earlier phases of the projects also produced 2 webinars, one with the Patient Representative Network and the other with the Genetic Alliance. For providers, the featured an article on its AMA Wire that included interviews with Rich Platt and Gerald. Next slide, please. Here are the 5 key components featured in each particular narrative describing FDA's mission and the critical aspects of Sentinel. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Here is an excerpt from the Patient Advocacy Group narrative from our earlier in 2018, describing Sentinel as a post-marketing surveillance tool that analyzes large groups of people by identifying patterns of negative side effects from the use of medical products. Next slide, please. As Danielle mentioned, FDA is in being as transparent as possible to share all of the activities of the Sentinel Initiative, as evidenced by this very effective website that we invite you all to explore. Next slide, please. Here is the specific link on the website to some of our work groups' deliverables. Next slide, please. As part of our efforts, we created this original infographic to be a very succinct explanation of a very complicated program. We deliberately wrote it at a reading level that would be accessible to the general public. It was not designed for sophisticated advocacy group leaders such as yourselves, but you may find it helpful for some members. Next slide, please. Although the Sentinel Initiative began in 2008, and the first projects of our work group occurred between 2016 and 18, FDA is now on the verge of expanding Sentinel into potential new areas, and now was a reasonable time to reach out to those same audiences to make them aware of these new developments. Next slide, please. What the work group did. We revisited the prior customized narratives. We revised them to include the new activities. Then we reached out to the same work group members who helped by providing focus groups and advice about how to craft the narratives and identify appropriate, relevant dissemination channels. Next slide, please. Here are the elements featured in the latest patient advocacy group's narrative, which explain Sentinel's expanding uses. Next slide. Here is the front page of that narrative that will be shared with you as part of your media toolkit. Special thanks to Braid Patrick Lake for contributing to this narrative. Next slide, please. Here is the new infographic describing Sentinel's use of real-world data. Again, this infographic was deliberately crafted for that audience, the general public, at a specific reading level. Next slide, please. Here are the 3 items contained within your media toolkits, which will be distributed by the National Health Council, including a sheet of FAQs. You will be able to access this toolkit on the website. Next slide, please. So much. Back to you, Eleanor.
Well, I want to thank you both for your presentations. I think it's been very helpful to have the view that you've provided. And I want to open to questions. So if anyone has any question that you'd like to ask, please. I'm going to kick it off with a question about the work that you've been doing. I know that we're at a point with Sentinel, as you've explained to me, this is under government contract. It's time for contract renewal. And so you can't really talk about what things are going to look like in the future because the new contract has not been awarded yet. And of course, that will dictate so much about what's going to be happening. But I'd like to hear from both of you about the kinds of things or the kinds of opportunities you would see for organizations that belong to the National Health Council and other patients to really be engaged in what's happening with Sentinel and what kind of role they might have, what role some of these organizations might have going forward as some of the new work gets rolled out. What are some of the things that you'd like to hear from this group in terms of their suggestions or your ideas for what might go forward? And our membership could give you their suggestions that might be tied to the things that you have in mind. Any thoughts on ways that you would see them being engaged in looking forward? And also for anyone who's on the line, if you have specific ideas that you'd like to present, I think this is an opportunity for the NHC membership to present some of those ideas or to send them in after this webinar. So jump right in there.
I'll go ahead and start. So something I was just thinking earlier, maybe since a lot of these patient groups, like depending on the disease that, the groups are covering, but we often have methods projects or something that we validate specific outcomes. So, I guess suggestions from others would be great on specific type of outcomes that they would find useful. We usually obviously assess the FDA for different outcomes to be validated first, which, sometimes includes additional resources, chart validation, but we would love to hear from, these groups, some of those things.
Great. Stephen, as a patient advocate who's been involved, ideas that you would have some of these groups to be thinking about or suggestions to station?
Well, I appreciate the question. It's one that you've raised during a couple of our discussions, and I believe it's a very important one, Eleanor. And I, again, echo what some of your ideas have been. And one of them was that the National Health Council can facilitate certain discussions with the FDA, and certain groups could leverage that invitation to reach out specifically about some of their ideas to interact with this specific tool. So I think that, again, I think I would love to hear from your members on this call some of their reactions to the presentation and some of the opportunities they believe they could present and add upon to benefit the data and the evidence that FDA is now expanding with the use of this tool.
Well, I think we can certainly facilitate those conversations, and we're happy to do that. And we can work with many of our members to get some additional ideas on some of the engagement that might be able to happen in the future. We had another question that came in through the function. It was just to ask along the same lines as what we've been talking about. As I said a few minutes ago, we can't give specifics about what's happening for the future because of this, the situation of not really knowing until a new contract is established. But because both of you have been involved for a while, could you talk a little bit about what you think would be a vision for the future of what's going to be happening with Sentinel, or how it might change in the future? Some of the vision for the direction that it might go in.
Like general kind of aims for the next 5 years?
Sure, yeah. That would be helpful.
Sure, I can just briefly maybe talk about what I was mentioning earlier we have in our strategic plan. So one of the aims is to enhance and expand the Sentinel Systems Foundation, including data, infrastructure. So we have a lot of expansion projects. Also, to augment safety analysis capabilities, and we're kind of expanding now into signal detection or signal identification area. We also are broadening the use of real-world data for real-world evidence. And I guess generally to broaden the Sentinel Systems ecosystem of stakeholders to pursue the vision of a national resource. And then the final aim was to disseminate knowledge and advance regulatory science, pretty much encourage innovation to meet our agency's needs. So a lot of the things are now moving towards machine learning, natural language processing, and things like that. Does that help a little? And then of course expand, like health records.
That sounds great. Another question has come up that's in line with what you're saying about electronic health records. Given all of this expansion and addition of data and more EHR data, patients are always concerned about their privacy, data security. Could you talk a little bit more about those aspects of Sentinel? I know that they are things that are given consideration as we've talked about it recently. So a little bit more on that to give people an idea of the level of data security measures that are taken?
I mentioned in one of the slides that patient privacy is our main goal. All data partners take that into consideration. We will, sometimes we'll get requests for different types of analysis that, let's say if race is important, and some of the smaller race categories, will have a lot less numbers. So when that happens, data partners can refuse to provide that because, they don't want to identify individual patients. So we take really all measures to make sure that patient privacy is preserved. But, the same way our data model and distributed database help with that as well. So that will always remain. It will never change.
We have another question that's come in about Sentinel as a national resource. I know that there have to be contracts in place for FDA to be able to use the data sources that it taps into. And so that might be part of what limits it from being a national resource. Could you elaborate on that, Daniela, about why isn't this just a publicly accessible resource that researchers could have access to?
I just want to make sure that I understand the question. Can you repeat it? Why is it not a national resource?
Yes, why is it not more of a publicly available national resource?
Oh, like why is it not available to public? So actually it is, we have through Randall Udall Foundation, Sentinel data is available to public. They can request different studies, they can look at different safety issues. It is available, and they would just have to contact them.
But I mean, if someone wanted to tap into the if someone wanted to tap into the database to do their own analysis, would they be able to do that?
Like an individual who has some research background wants to use Sentinel?
Yes, I believe that's what the question is. So, for example, if a patient group wanted to do an analysis, might a patient group be able to tap into it?
So I think it's more like related to operations and infrastructure and how the data are kept, that, you know, the access is not as available as, you know, you would have access to some other data. But I would have to probably defer maybe Rich, or I think it's related to that, you know, general structure. It's not like, oh, FDA is just, you know, holding the data away. But it, you know, as I mentioned, they access it through the foundation, but I don't think that anyone would provide them with the actual data to kind of like do their own analysis. And I want to say it's probably part of the way it's initially. Okay, great. Rich can talk about it.
Hi, everybody. This is Rich Platt. Hi, folks. Can you hear me?
Hi, Rich. Rich, I was going to have you unmuted if but you're not. So please jump in.
Okay, so I'll just add what Daniela said. The Reagan-Udall Foundation is one mechanism by which people and organizations outside of FDA can engage with the Sentinel data partners, and that's specifically the program. Another mechanism that's available to the general public and probably more accessible and is available specifically to NIH investigators and others funded through not-for-profit organizations is the NIH Collaboratory Distributed Research Network. And maybe in the show notes we can put the link to both of those organizations. And so it's those are both mechanisms by which organizations or investigators can engage with the Sentinel data partners. One thing that is a foundational principle of Sentinel is that the data partners choose to participate on a case-by-case basis. Everything that FDA asks them opt in, and so that's true for anything that an external organization would propose, and this wouldn't be a complete answer if I didn't say there would be involved in actually executing a collaboration with the Sentinel data partners. So it's a long-winded way of saying it is a national resource. It's not free, and the engagement would be as a collaborator, not as someone who's sort of purchasing access to a data source. I hope that's helpful.
Let me summarize that. Yes, I think it is. Let me summarize what I think I heard. I think it's a resource that's been pulled together because it helps the FDA do its work, and that's why the FDA has invested in it. Because there is expense involved, it can be made accessible to others who want to do research, do it through the existing collaboratory or the existing investigators that are there. They would partner with them in some way, and there would be some cost involved because there would be some resources that would be needed to conduct the evaluation. Is that fair to say?
Yep, did it well.
Terrific. Good. I just get to another couple of questions that we had here. How, if a patient group or healthcare professionals, we also have professional associations in our membership or others want to make suggestions of what data needs to be collected or they think should be collected and recorded in this kind of a database, how would they go about making those suggestions? Who would they suggest it to? By what mechanism?
So they could contact us directly, but something to keep in mind is that that I will call it data partner, the future or possible data partner, would need to be willing to, transform their data into a common data model. So, just by, someone recommending, sometimes not every, I guess, institution would have means to, it takes a lot of resources. So I was recently asked, why don't we add, some little community centers data, and, there's a lot of different types of data that we could still, that patients could benefit from, but unfortunately, it requires infrastructure. But they can always help to contact us to that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's good. So I think anyone who wants to make suggestions should be sure that they have good documentation for why they believe what they're suggesting is important, and that would help to make it to the partners that are doing the data collection and in some way convince them that it's important to spend the resources on to get that data. Another question that I have is, how would you differentiate Sentinel from AIRS so that who's heard of AIRS before would know the difference between the two of them?
Are you referring to FAIRS?
The Adverse Event Reporting System, ERS, AIRS.
So yeah, so we use both of them, and they complement each other when we're looking at regulatory questions. But FAIRS is a little more what we refer to passive system, and it's based on different data. So in FAIRS, providers as well as industry, they submit spontaneous reports as opposed to claims data in Sentinel. I mean, there are a lot of differences, but we use both. I guess maybe a question should be a little bit more specific. What exactly they refer to?
Well, I think it would be important for you to describe how they're different from one another.
Yeah, so for every FAIRS report that we receive, we actually have, the full narrative, the individual. Sometimes we'll have, probably say they don't contain the same type of information. So it requires hands-on individual case report review, which do a lot of, when we look at data, it's more aggregated, as opposed to FAIRS where it's like individual reports. And they're submitted voluntarily for FAIRS, as opposed to claims that are generated regardless of, whether we choose to have a claim. We don't choose to have a claim or not. It's going to be generated, but FAIRS reports are voluntarily submitted to us.
So the Sentinel is made up of claims and electronic record bases that are assembled from various sources to get large amounts of data, and so they may not be very specific to an individual complaint because it's based on billing data or medical records data, as opposed to the FAIRS data, which would be submitted very specifically individual by individual because it was the first they experienced. And you may not know that individual's name, but you know a lot about the actual event that happened to them. And so in that way, these two are different from one another, but they complement one another.
Definitely, they complement one another. And we often use affairs can be a starting point for, let's say, a safety issue that came to someone's attention who was reviewing affairs report. So this is kind of like an initial safety evaluation, and then we pursue Sentinel study to confirm this safety, I'll call it signal, but safety issue. So we often, get individual patient information that kind of leads us to look at it at the population level.
Okay. I have another question. It really is more about what's in the database, so a little bit more in depth. It appears age, gender, and geographic location are included in, but that ethnicity is not. Ethnicity can certainly play a role in the effects of drugs and devices, but is typically not very well captured or might be overlooked in trials. There's not usually enough diversity in clinical trials. So is there a particular reason why ethnicity doesn't get captured in Sentinel?
So I would say we have about 50% of our data that captures race or ethnicity. If that number is wrong, please correct me, but the last time, if I remember correctly, it was about half. So it's not that we don't capture it, but you have to think of it as, these data are, when you're enrolling in a health insurance plan, is this something that is required to fill out? Obviously, your age is always going to be required, so you're going to have your age, but is ethnicity something that your insurance plan, wants to know or not? So some people, some plans may not even have that field. Some people may choose not to answer. So it really depends on, on their end. So it's not us. If it's populated, we will have it. But if it's not populated, there's nothing we can do. So some data partners,
so really
may have.
Yeah. It's really not a matter that is intentionally leaving it out. It's really more of a matter that it's a matter of missing data. Some just don't collect that information, and therefore you don't have access to it.
Exactly. And, if you think about it, also, weight is something that is very important. We would love to have 100% of data. We would love to have weight, height. A lot of, unfortunately, it's not always provided.
Understood. So I am out of questions. I don't see any others coming in through the chat, but I really would like to take this opportunity to thank both of you for doing this webinar for us. We really appreciate your time and effort in going into this. Rich, we appreciate you being on the line to help answer some questions. I just want to state that the National Health Council and its members are very excited about being able to interact with you and be able to provide more input or help with dissemination. I think it's worth some additional conversations to figure out how we can work together and how you might be able to leverage the great resource that the National Health Council can be in terms of patient engagement and the patient voice. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone who's been on the line today. We appreciate your joining us.